Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to our keynote address this afternoon. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Justin Reich from MIT, who is a learning scientist, and he's interested in learning at scale, practice-based teacher education, and the future of learning in a networked world. He's an assistant professor in the Comparative Media Studies Writing Department at MIT, and he's the director of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. And this lab designs, implements, and researches the future of teacher learning. So the title of his new book is absolutely pertinent to the theme of our conference here today. Failure to disrupt: why technology alone can't transform education. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Justin has to say to this. So Justin, with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, and I'll manage the chat for you in the background.
Terrific. Well, thanks everyone for joining me on the afternoon. If there are folks who are watching this on the recording because they were spending today organizing for mutual welfare, I send you my special greetings. So I'm a former high school history teacher and now teach at MIT. My life in some respects has overlapped the life of the personal computer. I was born in 1977, one of the first years that Jobs and his colleagues put together an Apple computer. Some of my earliest memories are messing around with an Apple II Plus and Zenith robot kits and things like that. And then when I started teaching in high school, secondary school in 2003, my department head said, "Can you teach world history?" And I said, no, I don't really know how to do that, but I promise by September I will learn. I really need this job. And then he said, well, all right, maybe. But also there's a cart of laptops in the back corner of the classroom. And in our 9th grade world history classes, we have this kind of experiment where we want you to use them every day. I said, you could put a cart of bananas in the back corner of the classroom and I'll use them every day. I really need this job. Unfortunately he gave it to me. And so I was certainly not the very first in the United States, but I was relatively early on to be in a position to teach in a one-to-one internet connected classroom. We had these great blue and orange clamshell MacBooks, this really iconic form factor that all the kids had. And we had an intranet service that was called First Class. That on servers did sort of basically everything Google Education now does on the cloud. And so, we had shared documents, we had messaging and all those kinds of things. And it was around the time in 2003 where just the world's cultural institutions, museums, universities, archives were digitizing their materials. And so it was just an extraordinary time to be a history teacher and to just, almost any primary source you could dream up. I wonder if this existed, like somewhere it did, and you could get your students, to get their digital hands on it and to dig right in. And it was an amazing time to teach. And then I also saw that I taught in a very affluent school, and the kinds of resources that it took to maintain this technology network for learning in one place, the kind of human work that it took to not just have computers in the room, but to do really interesting things with them was a lot and was expensive and was complicated. And so as I left teaching, as I became a doctoral student, I've always had my sort of I kind of listen to stories that people tell about the future of technology, but having lived through many of them, able to bring a certain kind of skepticism to it. Once I finished my doctorate, I was hired by Harvard University in 2015, right after Harvard and edX had gotten started. It was 2013 that I got hired there. 2013. I was the first employee that Harvard hired to conduct research on the edX enterprise. If any of you have ever taken a Harvard X or MIT X or Stanford edX course and done the pre-course survey, I wrote that. Joined that institution at a time, again, where there was sort of extraordinary hopes for how these things were going to transform education, but went into it kind of thinking, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to make human learning systems better. That's not a knock on the people who are trying to do it. That's a recognition of the height of the mountain that we try to climb together. So I wrote this book, Failure to Disrupt, which I'll tell you some more about this afternoon, to try to explain to folks who had really big eyes for what the future might look like, why the challenges they were taking on were really hard, but also how we might work together to take on those challenges. So another way to frame it is that for the past 2 decades, education technology evangelists have promised us that we are on the cusp of profound transformation in learning environments. Clay Christensen, who is a Harvard Business School professor, in 2009 wrote this book called Disrupting Class, where he promised that by 2019, by 3 years ago, half of all secondary school courses in the United States would be online. They would cost 1/3 as much to provision. Secondary school costs would go down by 1/3 or 1/6 if you multiply those two numbers together, with better learning outcomes. There was one of the MOOC pioneers who founded Udacity, Sebastian Thrun, said that in 50 years, there's going to be 10 institutions in the world making higher education content, and Udacity could be one of them. Sal Khan in 2011 gave this TED talk called Let's Use Video to Reinvent Education, where he had this vision that young people would come to school, and when they learned maths, they would sit in front of a terminal, and the terminal would deliver to them an algorithmically optimized series of mathematical learning exercises. And each student would be able to proceed at their own pace in this algorithmically optimized way. And there would be teachers around. Teachers would grab groups of advanced students and do projects with them. And they would grab groups of remedial students and give extra help and things like that. But the sort of heart of the mathematical learning experience would be this relationship between an individual student and his or her computer terminal. And then there was this guy, I don't know if you remember this guy, Sugata Mitra. He's from your neck of the woods, so I blame you all for him. But he won the 2013 TED Prize. And this little quote in the bottom right is from his submitted keynote address, the kind of blurb for his keynote address at the Learning at Scale conference, where he had this argument that like all these guys were wrong because you didn't even need schools or institutions. The most startling finding of all, groups of children with access to the internet can learn anything by themselves. Groups of children with access to the internet can learn anything by themselves. Now, for any of you who have been parents over the last 2 years, you can confirm with apodictic certainty that children giving access to laptops cannot learn anything by themselves. It was now almost 3 years ago that the world was blighted by a terrible pandemic. Maybe as many as 1.4 billion learners around the world were sent home in one form or another for emergency remote learning. And in some respects, this actually improved the sort of theoretical prospects of the education technology evangelists. Because remember, for 2 decades, the education technology evangelists had promised us that we were on the cusp of having technologies that could replace and improve upon our existing educational system. But now they didn't even need to do that. They only needed to improve upon a broken pandemic hobbled system. And I think most people's experience was that emergency remote learning, the hybrid learning, lots of the forms that have come since, we're somewhere between disappointing and disastrous. That there, for sure, I think there were a minority of learners who discovered, holy smokes, this online learning stuff is great. This is a lot better than what I was doing before. But for most people, they experienced something between frustration and suffering while trying to participate in these new technology-mediated learning environments. This was not the revelation that the education technology evangelists were hoping would appear in this moment. There are all kinds of conferences that went on I don't know if you went to any of these in like April or June of 2020 that were like the dawn of the online learning era. As parents were home tearing their hair out, they didn't feel like they were at the dawn of that era. We did a bunch of additional research during this period in various kinds of ways. One of the things in the United States, I don't know what happened in the UK. In the United States, education researchers were overwhelmingly interested in 2 questions. Under what conditions are schools opened or closed? And what will happen to test scores? And those are, in my mind, reasonable questions, but they are not all of the questions that are important to ask about the last 3 years. one of the questions that we were really interested in is what was actually happening in schools, in classrooms, in university lecture halls, in students' homes. Like, what was the actual experience of students trying to learn during this period? So we did a bunch of forms of research. We interviewed 100 teachers across the country. We brought together these sort of design charrette groups. We had about 250 teachers do a kind of survey exercise with their 5,000 students. So there's a bunch of stuff at tsl.mit.edu/COVID-19 that describes some of this. And actually our most recent work has been a project called Subtraction in Action, which you can find on our Teach Lab podcast. And the idea is over the last 6 months, again, these sort of economist policymakers drive me nuts. And they've spent the last 6 months yelling in American schools and telling them that kids have lost a lot of learning, so they just need to do a bunch more. They need to add more tutoring, they need to add more extended day, they need to add summer school. And I just look at these economists and I'm like, have any of you ever stepped foot in an American school over the last 6 months? People are exhausted. They're not going to generate your new programs and have them work in any kind of reasonable timeline that, or the timeline that kind of you're imagining. Not that it's necessarily a bad idea. I mean, tutoring is a good idea, but it just seemed totally divorced from what was actually happening in schools. So our belief was that if you're in a period in which people are exhausted and institutions aren't working the way we want them to work, you can't fix them by adding stuff. You actually have to start fixing them by subtracting. You have to start finding things that are marginal and taking them away. And so that's what we've been encouraging folks to do. So that's a little preview of some other work that you can investigate. So what did some of these kinds of things find, and how does it connect to failure to disrupt? It'll all loop back together. One of the things we're interested in is what were the technologies that for sure US K-12 schools were using, but as I've talked to people around the world, I think you can tell me what happened in the UK, but I think these findings, at least people have told me these findings resonate in lots of different places. Again, people have told us we're on this cusp of this revolutionary era in technology. So what were the technologies in remote schooling? Were they MOOCs? Were they AI? Were they VR? Were they XR? Were they learning analytics? What was it? My argument is that the two most important technologies in remote schooling are two of the very oldest, most basic technologies that we have. The kind of heroes of remote schooling. Hero number one were learning management systems. Schoology, Google Classroom, Canvas, and learning management systems were theorized in the 60s and 70s. They were commercialized in the 90s. They were made open source in the 2000s. And my daughter, who's in elementary school, has a purple folder in her backpack. And one side says to home, and the other side says to school. And this is how she passes documents back and forth with her teacher. And learning management systems, maybe they do a lot of things, but that is really the main thing they do. They are a digital purple backpack folder that pass documents back and forth between teachers and students. And then the second technology that was dominant during the pandemic is the one that we're using right now. In the 1930s, when it was introduced, it was called video telephony. But Zoom won, and we call it Zoom now, or video conferencing or video calling or other kinds of things like that. You all know as educators, if you describe Zoom to someone who's not a teacher, it sort of sounds like it has pretty good functionality. Like someone can talk and you can see that person and you can see some slides or other things they project. And that person can sort of see like a gallery of the heads of some of the people who were there. It kind of sounds like teaching, but for those of you who have taught on Zoom, you know that teaching through Zoom is a bit like teaching through a keyhole, where with some awkward straining, you can kind of see and hear what's happening on the other side, but it's not really conducive to meaningful interaction. But two of the things that these technologies had going for them was they were incredibly familiar. They were new to some people, but relative to other things, they were incredibly familiar. And they allowed schools to reproduce as closely as possible the typical routines of in-person classrooms. My experience is that sort of instructional designers in the cusp of this area in the spring of 2020 were on the one hand trying to communicate to people, we know a lot about online learning and how you do online learning well. And it is really different than in-person learning, like a totally crazy thing to do, a thing to do that would be totally contrary to 40 years of instructional design, learning engineering kind of research. would be to just like walk away from your lectern and sit down in front of your home office webcam and keep teaching the way that you've been doing before. But for a variety of reasons, that is exactly what most higher education faculty did and what most K-12 schools, certainly in the United States, did. These kinds of things tended to get supplemented. The sort of layer 2 of technology remote schooling is that schools would pick like one math app, they would pick one kind of reading app, they'd pick some supplementary content, they'd pick some kind of collaboration software, Flipgrid, Jamboard, something like that, to kind of have some more stuff to sort of shove into to these learning management systems. In the spring of 2020, if you were a US middle school student, it was entirely possible that you had 6 or 7 teachers, math, science, health, whatever else, and each of them independently selected a set of these sort of infrastructure tools, and you went home and your parents had to write up a list of, if they had 2 kids, 14 logins and 14 different passwords, and it was total chaos, and parents were miserable. And so one of the changes that schools made was to sort of homogenize this variety and make sure that when students came back in September of 2020, I think you all a little earlier than that in most places, that they had a much more consistent, smaller set of these things to work through. So it kind of led us to 2 paradoxes, and I think both elements of both of these paradoxes are important. So on the one hand, educators in the United States, in a very short period of time, dramatically changed the operation of schools. They changed schools in ways that people would have thought in February of 2020 were just totally unimaginable. On the other, lots of late nights, lots of hard work, blood, sweat, tears, the whole bit. And the thing that they made was this kind of kabuki version of in-person schooling, where we sort of just modeled, even when it was awkward and not working, the sort of structures and routines of in-person schooling online using Zoom and learning management systems. And then another thing, which I think is incredibly important for people who are working with educators in the years ahead, is that educators showed tremendous capacity for change. We interviewed a group of high school principals in Madison, Wisconsin, high school educators, and one of them said, "We know how to change. We've been changing every 3 weeks for the last 18 months. We know how to change." That's important. You would not have gotten that kind of statement out of a lot of American educators in 2019, and you would have much more of that sense of possibility. But that possibility was paired by this sort of gut-ripping exhaustion that people are just absolutely really, really tired. As I think about working in schools in the future, at universities of the future, a lot of what I think about is how do we restore that sort of sense of urgency, that sense of change, that sense of innovation, that sense of possibility, even though it didn't necessarily go in all the directions I would have hoped, and even though people are really tired right now. But how do we help people remember, that what we did during that period was in many ways really extraordinary, and we can leverage that innovation moving forward. But I think these findings align with what I think of as kind of the 2 bedrock findings of the history of education technology. If you were to take really 60 years, you all probably know this, but I try to remind people all the time, when we had computers in the 1960s and 1970s that were the size of your living room, one of the very first things we did was we had computer scientists and learning scientists partner together to try to figure out how to do better teaching and learning. Education technology is not new. It is a 60, almost 70-year enterprise now, and we know a lot about it. And to me, these are the 2 sort of bedrock findings. The first is that when teachers get access to new technologies, they use them to extend existing systems. We've known this since the 1980s, Judith Sandholz and the Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow project, where they filled up these schools with these brand new personal computers, they networked them, printers, robots, probes, the whole bit. And what teachers do when they get access to new technology is they use it to do the exact same things they were doing before. And we only get to new practice over pretty long periods of coaching, of support, of experimentation, of peer learning, and time, a good bit of time. And then where there is beneficial innovation and new practice with education technology, it disproportionately benefits the affluent. It disproportionately benefits the people with the financial, social, and technical capital to take advantage of new innovations. I think there's now a really substantial body of research that just points in the direction of it's not universal, but almost any time you're bringing technology into the mix, you're really raising the threat of exacerbating inequalities. It's not guaranteed, but sort of naively moving forward or just moving forward out being really attentive to how people from different backgrounds, different life circumstances, not only access technologies, but participate in social systems, what kinds of barriers there are to any kind of access, to any part of participation, to inclusiveness, to belongings. Without real serious attention to those things, a lot of what we build tends to disproportionately benefit the most affluent. We certainly saw that in the United States, where well-connected schools and well-resourced neighborhoods more or less have done fine through the pandemic. Some students had devastating experiences, but a lot of them did fine. And much more suffering, much more difficulty in the places with less resources. Now, there are some people who've started to sort of revisit their thinking in light of the fact that the sort of revelation didn't come. So this is an interview that Sal Khan gave to District Administration magazine. There are millions of people who watched his 2011 TED Talk. There are far fewer people who read his January 2019 interview in District Administration magazine, this little magazine for kind of head teachers, school superintendents in the United States. Now that I run a school, I see that some of this stuff is not as easy to accomplish compared to how it sounds theoretically. It's taken me a while to realize this. So Sal Khan built his own school. Between 2011 and 2019, he had this whole online thing, but he actually built a physical school called the Khan Lab School, Khan Lab Academy, something like that, where he wanted to put in practice all of the ideas that he had been working on. And he found that even in his school, he couldn't really do it. And then eventually started saying, what we're finding is that we can just get people to use our software's practice problems, one class period a week, then we're going to see, 20% greater than expected gains or something like that. And that's exciting because that's a dosage that's doable. So it's the best of both worlds. We'll get some improvement and without having to change the curriculum much. And I thought to myself, man, that model sounds awfully familiar. And you can go back to the 1990s in the United States, Ken Kadinger and colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, who did the exact same thing in Pittsburgh in the 1990s, where they took computers that had self-paced practice problems. They tried to get teachers to use them 2 days a week and teach regular math 3 days a week. But the teacher said, no, this is probably good for just about 1 day a week. And they got, roughly the same magnitude of benefits as Sal Khan found, 3 decades later. Some of what you could say is that what Sal Khan and his colleagues figured out after, 10 years and $150 million of philanthropic investment, they could have discovered by taking a trip to the library. We have been working on these problems for a long time. They are problems in which if we make progress, it's going to be through a kind of shoulder to the wheel approach. There's a book that I really like about the One Laptop Per Child program by Morgan Ames, who's in the University of California system, called The Charisma Machine. And she describes these two stances. One stance she calls the charismatic stance. And this is kind of what Sal Khan sounded like in 2011. It's the idea that technology disrupts and transforms existing systems, that the future is going to be brand new and different because of technology. And she contrasts that with what she calls the tinkering stance, which she names after David Tyack and Larry Cuban's book, Tinkering Towards Utopia. And as my colleague Mimi Ito says, another way to understand it is that technologies don't disrupt existing systems. Technologies are domesticated by existing systems. Existing systems look at technologies and say, you fit here. MOOCs come onto the scene and MOOCs say, we're going to completely rearrange higher education. And higher education goes, nope. What you are going to do, MOOCs, is you are going to help us offer low-cost master's degree to people who already have master's degree. And then MOOCs go, oh, okay, we'll do that. Our existing systems domesticate new technologies. And so then you could say the future is actually an extension of trends from history And making systems better looks more like tinkering than it does like revolution. It looks more like a kind of shoulder the wheel, incremental process of continuous improvement, more than it does these sort of big disjunctive breaks. As my colleague Ken Katinger says, step change is what 25 years of incremental change looks like from a distance. I think there were two big mistakes that the charismatic technologists made during the pandemic that we can learn from and continue to try to correct in the future. One just sort of category error is thinking that, the idea of technology being able to disrupt sort of assumes that technologies have these kind of all-purpose functions, that they sort of sweep through all of maths or all of science or all of literature. But our learning technologies they're not all-purpose. They serve certain students in certain contexts, in certain subjects, and not others. And it's like each of them is sort of a ratchet, like a specially shaped ratchet head, and education is just this giant field of lots of differently shaped bolts. And it's good to build a ratchet that tightens down a bolt, but you just tighten down, just because you build one ratchet head that tightens down one bolt, there's still lots of other bolts of lots of other sizes to be tightened down. And so it's a lot of work to build all these things. And then, probably most importantly, this is, I think, so central to your work. And I think a point that I am constantly trying to emphasize to policymakers, to parents, other folks in education who don't know all the things you do. Learning technologies are not a switch that you flip on and off. You don't download the stuff onto people's machines and go, okay, now the learning is happening. They are only as effective as the communities that support their use. And those communities are human, and they take time and energy and effort and experimentation and rest and coaching to learn. And if we don't provide all of those learning resources, then we're not going to see the improvements from technology. I mean, the reason why, after many years, 20 years now since 2003, I'm still interested in learning technologies is sort of less about what the technologies do and more about, I've just seen over and over again in communities that when learning technologies are introduced, it is a particular moment. It is a unique kind of catalyst to invite people to have conversations about curriculum, about pedagogy, about our relationships with our students. And that, to me, is probably the most magical thing about technology. I do think there are some magical kinds of learning experience that can be created, but actually the way that it helps faculty learn or be open to learning is what keeps me engaged all these years later. That and just the sort of pathological hatred of VC-funded education technology evangelists, and proving they're wrong is also enormously satisfying, I'll admit. Okay, so what are you going to find in the rest of the book? All kinds of people need to evaluate new technologies, and the first half of the book really tries to help them do that, in part by encouraging them to ask the question, what's new? If this is a 60, 70-year enterprise that dates back from the oldest days of computers, and if enormous numbers of very, very smart people with lots of money have worked on this, then there really is not anybody out there who's going to be inventing brand new technologies. Instead, what people are going to be doing is inventing things that are small improvements on stuff that's already out there. So one of the most important things that you can do if you're trying to introduce new technologies, if you're trying to help people introduce new technologies, is to just have some framework, some schema of thinking about what existing technologies are and how a new thing might fit into that. So I argue that one of the most useful questions we have to ask is who guides the sequence of learning activities. I'm particularly interested in these ideas of technologies for learning at scale, technologies that allow many, many learners to learn with relatively few experts to guide them. And I think there are basically three types of these tools. There are learning experiences where the sequence of experiences is assigned by an instructor or a team of instructor, like a massive open online course. That there can be a sequence of learning experiences that are assigned by an algorithm, like Khan Academy or an intelligent tutor. And there can be sequence of learning activities that are designed by peers, like the Scratch learning community or the sort of original connectivist MOOCs for people who are interested in those way back. And then I try to explain to people that these three categories are sort of made up of a relatively small number of building blocks. Like to the first approximation, there are basically two ways to teach. We either pour stuff into people's heads or we get them to explore the world around them. We fill pails or we kindle flames, in the sort of famous summary of Plutarch. In the United States, we have these two education psychologists named Thorndike and Dewey, who are sort of the champions of these two approaches. And we really actually don't have that many technologies either. Like if you look at massive open online courses are learning management systems with an autograder shoved on the top of it. And they tend to embrace Thorndykean sorts of pedagogies, and that's basically it. And we now have a pretty good amount of research on online self-paced learning. We know that for the most part, it works really well for already educated, already affluent people. If you want to help someone earn their second master's degree, something like a MOOC is a pretty good choice. If you want to help onboard, disaffected learners back into the higher education system, self-paced online learning is, in almost all cases, really not a very good choice for that. What most people need to learn are other people. And technologies can provide some of that, but miss a lot of it. So that helps us figure out, like, okay, what shaped ratchet head is our MOOCs, and what kind of bolts can we tighten down with this particular ratchet? I take a little bit of time in the book to explain to people that almost all adaptive software is based on a statistical toolkit called item response theory, developed at education testing services in the United States in the 1980s. And that it is really not that hard to understand. And I take some time to explain that. So when, the sort of Jose Ferreira's the world, I don't know if you all remember Newton, but he was this guy who came along who tried to sort of sell adaptive learning as a service. Give us your problem sets and we'll make them adaptive. And he just tried to, claim that what he was doing was this totally magical, completely, technologically advanced stuff. And his engineers actually on blogs were writing posts that were literally like how we use two-parameter item response theory to make adaptive learning happen. And we know things about instructional tutoring. There's certain domains, math, computer science, early acquisition of language, where like maybe it sort of works okay. It's not transformative, but you can eke some learning gains out of it. And there are lots of places where it doesn't work as well. And then we have this whole category of peer-guided learning at scale kinds of technologies, and lots of us get super excited about them. And lots of people are actually quite good at using these kinds of learning environments in their own informal learning. People are gardeners, or they learn to, raise plants, to do their hair, do their makeup, beat a level in a video game, draw, play an instrument, all this kind of stuff. People teach themselves in an amazing way. And then you try to teach them algebra using the same methods, and they're like, oh, this is terrible. Even more than terrible, it's confusing. These learning environments, people typically find them confusing. They find they don't integrate very well into school systems. It's magical when you can do it, but really quite hard. So for almost anything new that comes along, you can kind of look at it and see how it fits into one of these three buckets. And if it's in one of these three buckets, you can say, well, here's kind of what we know about it. Like, here's probably what the technology is. Here's probably what the pedagogy is like. Here's some of the research evidence we have on things that are like it. And from all that, we can say, all right, here's where you might see some marginal gains if you put a whole bunch of time behind it. That's, and that's not to diminish marginal gains. Like, marginal gains is what we get in education. What we get is lots of shoulder to the wheel work, trying to make things a little bit better. But it's helpful if we stay away from the kind of magical thinking that just choosing the right one of these is going to lead to some kind of transformation in education. Why will it not lead to one of these kinds of transformations in education? Because there are a series of problems that cut across all three genres of learning at scale that we have not been able to solve. And I've alluded to some of these already, but I'll walk you through. These are kind of four things for education technology developers, for education technology researchers, for instructional design practitioners, researchers. These are the kinds of problems that I see as sort of the generational challenges of our era. That if we can figure some of these things out, we could start unlocking more of the potential of learning technologies. So one challenge is what I call the curse of the familiar. In the United States, in secondary schools, the most widely used piece of learning software outside learning management systems and student information systems is a tool called Quizlet. It was made by an MIT dropout. You probably have students who use it in the UK, and they're basically digital flashcards. answers on one side, questions on the other side. You can share decks of flashcards with other people and it'll quiz you. If we got around, something like half of all high schoolers in the United States use this every month. If you got around a bunch of educational experts and said, what do educational systems really need to improve? There is nobody who would raise their hand and say, you know what, we have a major dearth of flashcards in US schools. There's just an index card shortage, not enough memorizing happening, not enough flashcards. No, this is not like a very serious problem that urgently needs new technologies to tackle. But part of its success is it's just you glance at Quizlet and you instantly know what this thing is. By contrast, when people build really cool things that operate really differently, the Scratch programming community, the Desmos mathematical programming interface and language, people are just confused. They don't know what to do with it. And the things that have the most potential to change our systems are also most likely to be rejected from the system as foreign. And so I have some ideas in the book about how you go about sort of navigating that curse of the familiar. How do you have things start in a familiar way and then lead people to unfamiliar places? How do you do the kind of community building, the sort of human networking that lets people learn to adopt new tools? A second challenge is what I call the EdTech Matthew effect. That we're always hoping that what happens is on the left, that new technologies would disproportionately benefit low-income folks, and what universally happens is on the right, well, not universally, but very, very commonly happens, is that new technologies disproportionately benefit people with the social, financial, technical capital to take advantage of new innovations. We can really well document how this happens. We have a few case studies of things that seem to be doing the opposite, but we don't have a very good understanding of what kinds of principles would lead us to build things that look more like the left, or what kinds of systems would we build that would look more like the left. There's lots of open research to be done there. The trap of routine assessment. There's many of our technologies that we require to evaluate human performance in order to help people figure out what they should do next. And computers are good at evaluating the kinds of things that computers are good at. So when things are routine, when they're highly structured, when there's well-known right answers or computable right answers, computers are good at identifying whether or not humans come up with those right answers. Unfortunately, the things that we need, if computers are good at assessing the kinds of things that computers are good at doing, then computers are good at assessing the kinds of things we don't need human beings to do anymore. And computers are not good at assessing the kinds of things that we really need people to do. Computers are not good at assessing ill-structured problem solving, complex communication. They're not very good at assessing reasoning from evidence in written form or oral form. The main thing that we teach in 20 years of an educational system is reasoning from evidence. And so being attentive to how auto graders can only evaluate select forms of human performance and how they miss really important evidence of human learning and human importance is really important for today's educators. And this challenge is just the sort of signature challenge for education technologists. And then a huge issue, which I think Europe is better positioned to handle than the United States is with our kind of cowboy technology culture, is that we know that complex technological systems can rapidly improve if you collect huge amounts of data about every action that every participant takes on that system, and you constantly subject those people to little experiments. 1% of the times you go to Amazon, they're testing whether or not the buy button should be blue or be red, and which of those things will make you buy more. It turns out that if you say the phrase experiment on children to school parents, they're not super enthusiastic about that idea, certainly not as enthusiastic as educational researchers are. And I think there are really quite serious concerns with having school systems be places where we, build a massive surveillance infrastructure that captures what students are doing at all hours of the day and inculcates students into a surveillance culture, even if what we think we're doing is, gathering data so we can do learning and analytics or help them learn. It doesn't sort of take away from the fact that we're preparing them for a chilling future version that's probably incompatible with a free civil society. And so figuring out how we think about taking advantage of the power of this kind of data, these kinds of experiments we can do with, what Bruce Schneider calls the toxicity of that data is another one of the signature challenges that we face. So these are kind of four intractable dilemmas that I think of as for junior scholars that are coming up in the field, or education technologists who are trying to figure out some of the thorniest challenges ahead. These are 4 areas that I would highlight where there's a lot of work to do. I'll pass on this and just get us to the, oops, I meant to stop here. The idea that I think this will be very common to you all, but it's the idea that I'm really trying to leave with your colleagues at other parts of higher education, other parts of the education system, is that the 2 big arguments of failure to disrupt are, one, that disruption and step change and huge breaks of the past, like, it doesn't make sense to plan and look for that. Where we do see progress and change, it is through a shoulder-to-the-wheel, continuous improvement kind of approach, where things just get 1% better and 1% better and 1% better. And those add up over time, but they don't add up to totally transformed looking systems. They add up to systems that keep performing a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And that work should be valorized. And that's how we should think of what the contributions of education can be. And that's, disappointing if you're a person who's hoping that we're on the cusp of a bright new future. But I think for most people in human development, they go, yeah, that's kind of how we learn. That makes sense. And then the second thing that I'm constantly trying to impress on people is that our technologies, a part of the reason for this is our technologies are only as powerful as the communities of people who guide their use. And it is when new technologies come along, these people have to develop new routines, new patterns, new schema of learning, new pedagogies, new relationships. And that work is time-consuming work and important work, but it is that human work that really leads to the gains. It's not the technology alone. It's the technology guided by communities of learners. And of course, you all are central in that very important mission. So I'll stop there. I see all kinds of things that are going on out there, and I'm excited to answer any of these questions or talk about anything else that anybody wants to.